Yes, it's almost 11 and let's start. Welcome to webinar 3 of Cities of Tomorrow. I'm Hamid Tavakoli and I'm going to spend the next 25 minutes showing you something that most strategic planning documents in this country don't show you. Not a theory, pure data from our cities, our suburbs, and our communities. And I want you to leave with one question you won't be able to shake. Are the decisions we are making today building resilience or quietly fragility? Let's find out. We begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country, and I mean this as more than a formality. First Nation peoples managed country as a single integrated system for tens of thousands of years, not separate departments, one living whole. What we're calling system thinkings today, they were practicing it before any city existed on this continent. We pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, talking about the two organizations behind today's session, Meso Space and Worsley Consulting manage these webinars for you. Meso Space is specialized in spatial analysis, evidence-based design, and system thinking for real decisions. And Worsley Consulting also working through regenerative thinking applied to how cities are physically built. Both firms encourage system thinking. So that's the point. And now, before going through the discussion, we're going to go through part one of the presentation today, which is the framework. We want to make a framework for understanding the cities. We maybe need to wash out what we knew before and just create a new understanding of the cities. First of all, why we need system thinking? What is the reason that we need system thinking? I can tell you at least two reasons, and you can find more and more reasons behind that. The first reason is that we need to move away from fragmented to holistic decision-making processes. The way that we look into the cities only relative to the boundaries of a city council is not working anymore, and we need to see the larger picture of the city. And we go through this in a few minutes. The second reason is that we need a new perception of councils. Traditionally, councils were equal to service providers who are collecting rubbish and, just looking after permits and, building construction and things like that. But now in the second part of the 21st century, the perception of councils has been changed towards being the biggest health provider of the city. They are bigger than any hospital. They are bigger than any rehabilitation center. And the responsibility is now to create well-being and health for residents and people. That's why we need system thinking in order to understand the city, the way that we change our perception of councils. Now, let's see what is the problem. Every council here is managing a capital project portfolio, including tens of millions in annual infrastructure spend. But the question is that, let's say I've got a capital project portfolio here, and I have a question whether I need to invest in infrastructure this year, or I might need to do some maintenance and operations, or probably is better to allocate most of this money to growth and investment. Then the two questions would happen. Where should we invest? And the fact that, is this project really responding to actual risk? So investment generally follows urgency. A flood triggers drainage. An election commitment triggers a road. But the underlying vulnerabilities has no department, no line item. They live in gaps between portfolios. That's why we need to realistically understand and define priorities, not what we gut feel, but what must be happen and should be evidence-based. Now, let's walk through a little game, what cities need and what cities face. On one side, the conditions that make a city work are including economy, public health, ecology, governance, infrastructure, and so on. On the other side, the risks are including urban heat island effect, flooding, bushfires, social vulnerability, economic decline, and so on. We need to know that these aren't two separate lists. They are opposite ends of the same systems. Let's have a look. If a bushfire happens, I should say there would be some issues with governance and planning, flora and fauna environment protection, and possibly infrastructure connectivity. Or let's say if there is urban heat island effect happening in the city, then I need to think about whether I've done my bits and pieces of flora and fauna environment protection well or not. So here, this slide shows how systems are not separate from the problems. They are different spectrums of the same system. Now let's talk about an honest picture of the cities. What cities need is that healthy communities, functioning ecology, connected infrastructure, effective governance, and so on and so forth. What cities actually face is that urban heat island effect, flooding, bushfire, housing unaffordability, social polarization, governance without coordination, and so on. Now, I have a question for you. Which column is your council's capital program actually responding to? Does your council have a mechanism, not a strategy, a mechanism that traces a risk back to the system that produced it? Like, for example, if you are, whether your council is only responding to urban heat climate stress rather than going back to the actual system that creates that is a big question. And unfortunately, in many cases, in most councils, respond to the right-hand column while underinvesting in the left one. We treat symptoms and we are genuinely surprised when the disease keeps coming back. Now, this is the climax of this discussion. This is the main point and the priority framework that we suggest in order to approve and provide such systemic understanding of the cities. The first priority in any city is human health and well-being. And that's why city councils are the major providers of health and well-being. This is relevant to the right to the city, food, education, basics, placemaking, social interaction, thermal comfort, and so on. After this priority, and only after this, the second priority would come in, which is including looking after flora and fauna, environmental protection, infrastructure and connectivity, and so on, which is talking about tree canopy, corridors, soil ecology, and so on. And bear in mind that number one and number two are complementary to each other. But only after doing one and two as a priority, we could expect sustainable governance and planning in place. As a result of implementing one, two, and third priority, then we can expect we would have economic sustainability too. And this is something that David would go through that in the part 4 of the discussion, how we system thinking could provide economic sustainability. Now, the question is, if human health is the priority in our system thinking from now on, then the question is how we can measure the health and well-being of human. The most powerful way to measure health and well-being across a city is by measuring the absence of it. The ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics Index of Relative Socioeconomic Disadvantage, we call it IRSD, is a postcode level health check, which is including low income, employment, education, housing quality, service accessibility, and provide a single score. If that score is below 989, as you can see here, then I could say that those suburbs would face high or very high vulnerability. So from now on, our measurement tool our lens through the city could be disadvantaged through our IRSD, below average in Australia. The fact that when that score persists below average across census cycles, you are not looking at temporary hardship. You are looking at something deeper, and this will open your eyes to the real issues. You call it permanent vulnerability. And I have a question for you right here. Have you ever run IRSD mapping against your infrastructure investment history? If not, I'll suggest you to do that tomorrow. Now, let's go through the case study one. The case study one is Adelaide, and I'm showing you, getting back again to that sort of theoretical framework which we developed as human health and well-being as the top priority of system thinking. I want to show you that how political planning context, in fact, the third priority in a city could affect the health and human well-being, which is the first priority. And this is the case of Adelaide. I want to show you how governance structure created permanent vulnerability in in Adelaide metropolitan areas since the last, during the last 30 years or so. Now, before going through that, I want to give you a very quick sort of overview of colonial origin and the state power in Adelaide. Adelaide, founded in 1837 by Colonel Light, the design of Colonel Light, in a grid system and in between, flanking a river, Torrens River in this case. And then in 1880, this is the urban development in 1880, and this is the modern boundaries of metropolitan areas. You can see small areas of the city being developed, and the rest of that would be parklands. And then this is the late 19th century, almost 20th century city development in Adelaide. And as you can see, Adelaide grid was imposed by governors, and that template, the state authority, again continued and persists to this day. And local councils, from the very origin, from the very beginning, inherited consequences they had no power to prevent. Now, this is even giving you a better picture, if you like. This is a strategic planning timeline of Greater Adelaide. You can find this in our paper published in Planning Institute of Australia, Australian Strategic Planning and Socio-Spatial Vulnerability. You can Google that and download that paper, but this is part of that paper. It clearly shows that every major decision from 1962, even before, to 2017 was made at the state level. Each launched with ambition, district centers, transit-oriented developments, with the big language of livability. Look, almost all of them are state level. So there's nothing happening through the local governments, and nothing is really proposed by local governments until the latest one, 2017 model. And now this is the outcome. This is the outcome of those top-down processes, if you like. 5 maps, 5 censuses, 30 years of disadvantage. And as you can see, these patches, these gray areas are the extent of disadvantage areas below average from 1996 all the way through to 2006, 2011, 2016, and 2021. What you can see here clearly, of course, the methods of calculating IRSD could be different over the course of 30 years, but you can see a clear sort of pattern here, the north of the city, the center, and then it even extends towards the south. And this is the outcome of that. And I want you to, from now on, look into your cities with the lens of vulnerability in order to fulfill system thinking in your design and planning. Now, going through the actual strategic plans, you can see here that, for example, in proposed Adelaide growth in 1987, the plan suggested some metropolitan districts separate from each other, divided by hill face zones. But in almost less than 4 years, by 1999, the extent of vulnerability, which is these red patches, are going well beyond the proposed areas. See how planning gets behind the actual needs of the communities. See what happened in Adelaide in 1987 plan. Again, this happens in 1992, where the city authorities proposed the 2020 Adelaide vision. And you can see that this is the boundary, proposed boundary. And then in almost around 14 years, the extent of vulnerable communities, the red patches, go well beyond these proposed areas, and almost half a city is covered by vulnerability. And you can see the same pattern here in 2006, where in 2011, almost 1/3 or half of the city is covered by vulnerability. Why is that? Why this has happened? Now, we get into the current time, getting closer to the current time, you see the same pattern just happened, where this is the 2017 version and this is 2010 version of the Greater Adelaide plan for Greater Adelaide, 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide. And as you can see, the actual vulnerability is happening in these areas, but the city authorities, the state level governance, propose these thoughts in order to ameliorate the city, in order to help the city to grow. So it looks like pretty irrelevant, given that thoughts are the signature component of the plan for years and years. Again, this happens in 2017, while the city officials propose capital cities and propose those thoughts around the center of the city. The vulnerability is quietly extending outwards towards the northern and southern suburbs. And this is the map that concludes the Adelaide research, if you like. This is the map of vulnerability for 5 censuses. So since 1996, these very black areas or very gray areas are part of the vulnerable suburbs of Adelaide. And as you can see, the regional centers are engulfed by vulnerability. These regional centers were proposed in order to improve the life of a human being, but look how they've been stuck inside these vulnerable components, vulnerable patches of suburbs. And then here in the right-hand side, you see how irrelevant is the proposed thought program with the extent of permanent vulnerability in Adelaide from 1991 to 2021. This was the case of Adelaide, and I would like to go through quickly to the case of Melbourne for you, and then in part 4, David would work through the details of actual design. But going through the case study of Melbourne, Adelaide shows that political planning structure, if you remember, that was the 3rd priority, could affect the community health and well-being. But in case of Melbourne, I want to overlay 2 layers for you. Environmental context against socio-environmental vulnerability. And I want to show you something which you probably never seen before, a new perspective into system thinking for our cities. In order to do so, I've just proposed 6 layers, but I want you to zoom into your specific city council if you like. I would talk about the larger metropolitan areas, but I would love you to go through your specific council and now have a different perspective about systems in your council. The first map, which I'll show you, is the permanent vulnerability from 2011 until 2022. And this is pretty similar to the case of Adelaide. I only show you where are the pockets of vulnerability spread around the metropolitan areas, and then you can think and judge about it yourself. The second section, I would go through accessibility versus urban vulnerability. And then we go through bushfire, the maps, the mapping of bushfire against vulnerable environments. And then we would go through heat island effect and tree canopy and urban vulnerability. Finally, I would give you an overall understanding of the city and greening opportunities that could be missed or already missed. So let's get into that. Yeah, this is the permanent vulnerability in Melbourne from 2011, 2022. This is the first time that I've published this map, and I would like you to go through that 3 census cycles, see how IRSD mapped across metropolitan Melbourne. Darker shading, lower score, and higher vulnerability. The geography disadvantage here is remarkably stable across decades. Unlike Adelaide, which was pretty fluctuating and just moving up and down, here it is very stable, and we need to do something about it. Not because it tells you something you don't feel, because it provides a realistic picture of the city for you. And I want you to go through your specific council, like if you're working in Casey, if you're working in Wyndham, what would happen here? Or if you're in Melton, look around and see what is the extent of vulnerability and the areas that have been vulnerable for more than 10 years. What's happened and how your plans are helping them or, you know, impacting them. Now, just a quick, I know that the definition of by definition, vulnerability is equal to lack of accessibility, but look at the practical picture here. Lowest socioeconomic communities have consistently the worst transport opportunity. Fewer bus routes, more dependent on the streets and car, and greater distances to job, healthcare, or possibly schools. Now, I should tell you that you can see many of these disadvantaged communities do not have access to the equal opportunity to the road and railways, most of them, or partially have access. This creates a double disadvantage. Communities already under pressure face environmental risk, and in terms of mobility, fewer resources, weaker institutional support, and so on. This is not a community service problem. This is a core infrastructure planning problem, I guess. Now, this is really interesting. We overlaid Melbourne's sociospatial vulnerability against bushfire-prone areas. The communities with least capacity to absorb shocks are not near bushfires. They are inside the bushfire risk zones. Look at the map. The yellowish gray patches are the communities which are both vulnerable and inside the bushfire risk areas. The communities with least capacity to absorb shocks are near bushfire, as you can see. Bushfire preparedness is not an equal starting line. We need insurance, a car to evacuate, time off work, emergency information in your language, a social network that gives you early warning. These are shaped by income, infrastructure, planning, and governance. Look how these areas, these communities are really threatened by bushfires. Now, I have an important question for you. Is your emergency management plan, your council, differentiated by community capacity, or does it assume everyone starts from the same position? Just think about it. Now, let's go through urban heat island effect versus vulnerability. As you know, urban heat island effect is a measurable temperature gap between a built-up area and the surrounding landscape. The highest urban heat intensity correlates strongly with the lowest socioeconomic communities. Why? Because the built form, impervious surfaces, dense housing, no canopy, older stock without insulation, concentrated, exactly where planning placed cheaper housing and low infrastructure investment. A resident in a high heat, low income suburb experiences temperatures 4 to 6 degrees higher, and is far less likely to have air conditioning or be able to pay the electricity or energy bills for that. Heat stress is not distributed by latitude. It is distributed by planning history. Look, this is again the same pattern: southeast, north, and west of Melbourne, mainly. This even become more interesting and more attractive. Look, did you know that tree planting without a spatial equity analysis can make rich suburbs richer and poor suburbs poorer? This is the case of Melbourne. We mapped canopy across Melbourne. Lowest socioeconomic areas have far fewer trees by design, not by accident. For the purpose of affordability and possible better revenue generation, they have smaller lots, green corridors sometimes removed, and natural systems somehow cut off. This stops the compounding effect of planting and makes it inefficient. Solo tree canopies do not work. They work well when they are clustered, clearly. And as if you look at this map again, you see the same pattern happening. The lower socioeconomic communities have access to lower canopy, and with adding more trees, we in fact create this gap to become wider and more serious between lower socioeconomic communities and better off communities. Melbourne has an urban forest strategy already, but a strategy alone will not fix a problem built into the planning system decades ago. That's why we need new models of urban forest strategy, ones that foresee those constraints and resolve them strategically and spatially. Now, this is the opportunity map which I'll share with you. This is showing the flood versus urban greening and indicates habitat connection potentialities throughout the city. At this point, I want you to have a new perspective of the city looking to this GIS map. This is the map I find most urgent, an opportunity that is actively disappearing. Urban development is systematically fragmenting the ecological corridors that connect Melbourne green wedges. Look at the map. So the growth areas in the Melton is clearly cutting off the connection in this sort of western wedges. Also, in the north, the same thing is happening. In the west and east also, the same thing is happening. Look what's happening. Once these areas are built over, they cannot be recovered. Our analysis estimates a 10-year window before these corridors are fully closed. For every council managing a growth area, this is this year's PSP review, this budget cycle, not the next budget cycle. And this brings us to the end of the discussion with system thinking, framework, and case studies. By now, I expect you already move out of the boundaries of your council and see the city as a whole, a giant living body of systems that interact constantly with no specific structure. This final map layers 3 realities: the built environment that's already there and can't be moved, flood corridors where water needs to go, and urban greening potential where nature could work. If we let it just move out of hand, what it shows here is that the cost of fragmented thinking is very expensive. Ecological opportunities systematically cut across by roads, by subdivisions, by drainage to build more water fast rather than hold it well. Look at this map and see these growth areas actually impeding and preventing these connections happening. Possibly like if you look at the Melton case study, for example, as I'm not singling out any specific areas, but this is the area which I already studied. So if you could have opened a space here so that these connections could be facilitated through, I guess we would have far more better cities. We didn't know probably individual tree planting in a way that this chunk of this chunk of open space could have helped the whole new development plan. All the way through, you got a lot of opportunities here that could be missed. And also here you can see, unfortunately, a lot of opportunities that disconnected the city and extend the arm of the growth to the cost of cutting off the connection of habitats. Thank you so much so far being with us. Now my colleague David Worsley will go through and show you how regenerative civil engineering translates and complements these principles into physical decisions that councils make every day. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Hamid. Just jump on to thank you. So thank you also to everyone for turning up today and providing us this platform. It's great to get the level of engagement that we've got. I've worked with Hamid for a number of years in different working relationships and environments, and it's great to join him today and everyone else at this webinar. So, as Hamid's saying, I'm coming from a different angle, but looking at how we can apply systems thinking from a technical perspective, but also a practical perspective when it comes to delivery of capital works. My background, I'm a chartered civil engineer. I got my start in Victorian local government. So I worked for a number of growth councils and more developed urban councils in Melbourne's West. And I worked in a number of roles around design, project management, construction, and even the operations side of things. And that was before I moved into consulting, which I've done for over 10 years now, working for major engineering firms. Nowadays, I consult primarily to local and state governments on a range of social and infrastructure and placemaking projects. And so I see my section about how we can tie together some of the themes that Hamid has taken us through, and provide you that perspective of an engineer. I'll introduce a few concepts like regenerative civil design and climate sensitive design that respond to this systems-based approach. Ultimately, this is about how we can apply systems thinking at a project level. So next slide, please, Hamid. So before I do, let's set the scene. So this chart here is produced by the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was prepared last year, and it shows the current projection of global emissions. So the red line there with the sort of deeper orange and the fainter orange, that shows you the current projection of global emissions and I guess the uncertainty in that pathway. And that's based upon the implemented policies as of last year. Now, the green shows the required pathways for limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, which is the Paris Agreement, and the blue is limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And clearly there's a huge gap between the different projections, and I suppose between reality and the aspirations that we all have. Now, I guess my takeaway is that the base case is that there will be continued warming and climate change is inevitable to a degree. It certainly doesn't mean that we stop all of the targets that we have when it comes to decarbonisation and so on. But I think it's more recognition of the importance of balancing two aspects, which I'll describe in more detail shortly. So next slide. Now, I want to take us through another chart, and this shows the difference in the projection of embodied carbon versus operational carbon. Now, operational carbon, I think, is quite familiar to a lot of people. That's really about the emissions associated with a physical asset or process in operation. So if you think about a car, for example, you compare the carbon emissions from, a internal combustion engine, a petrol-based car, versus one that's an electric vehicle. The operational carbon footprint, I think we conceptually appreciate. And that's the same sort of principle when it comes to built form assets, so buildings in particular. Now, decarbonising operational carbon is where a lot of the focus has been to date, and that's about electrification of everything. So yes, EVs, heat pumps instead of gas, for example, and of course renewable energy. These are the low-hanging fruit. And so you can see in the chart, and the black is the operational carbon emissions. You can see from the chart that operational carbon is clearly dropping very quickly and rapidly, and projected to continue to do so towards net zero by 2050. But if you look at embodied carbon, which is all of the carbon associated with the creation of the asset and the destruction of the asset at the end of its life. Now, to give an example, in the case of a road, embodied carbon is everything from digging or mining the material out of the natural ground in a quarry, um, processing that material at a plant, transporting that to site, building that road, and then replacing that road, and then demolishing it at the end. So you can see embodied carbon is projected to continue to rise. Um, and that's because operational carbon in a way is low-hanging fruit. We really understand very well how do you decarbonize operational carbon? Yeah, you electrify things, but embodied carbon is much more challenging. Next slide. Now, one more slide to set the scene. Are we meeting our climate targets? I've talked about at a global level, the Paris Agreement and the objective to limit global warming by 1.5 to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. But down at the local council level on the right of screen, these are two common targets that I see across a number of different councils in different geographies across Australia. Net zero operations. So, reverting to the previous slide, operations, right, is one key piece of the puzzle. And a lot of councils are looking to achieve that by anywhere from last year to 2030. The longer aspiration, and really this is where embodied carbon and that great challenge applies, is net zero targets for their communities, and that's by either 2040 to 2050, depending on the council. How are we going with those climate targets? Maybe ask yourself and reflect. Are you even aware of what your local targets are? And certainly, how is it being implemented in I suppose more tangible actions when it comes to your day-to-day work? Next slide, please, Hubbard. So with that said, I'm now going to take a look at how do you apply systems thinking in project governance. And when I say projects, I'm talking about capital projects. So I'll put forward two different structures of project governance on the next slide. And here, let's take a typical capital project structure, delivery structure. So below council, there's a project sponsor, which is typically a directorate of council. It might be infrastructure, it might be community services, or open space. And below that sits a central project management entity, and that either is a council officer internally, or it might be an external project management consultant. And they're, I guess, responsible for managing relationships in various directions. Obviously up the org structure within council, laterally with internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, and then down when it comes to the lead consultant, the consulting team, the delivery team, who are tasked with implementing the strategic objectives that have generated this project. Now, there's a project working group quite commonly, which I've dashed there, There's various, of course, I suppose there are variations to this structure. You might have PCGs either in lieu or and with PWGs. You might also have steering committees and so on, but you get the picture. Now, a major challenge for this model is getting the best value out of the consultant team. And it's driven, there are a number of reasons, but um, it's in particular, it's driven by priorities that are set when creating these project structures and these procurement models. The typical model involves a non-technical lead with technical and specialist disciplines or sub-consultants, and they're brought in at times agreed with and by the lead consultant. Um, if you think about how are these procured, well, typically a dominant weighting consultant team selection by council set out in their criteria is financial. It's the fee, in other words. The fee I see regularly, it might be a 30 or 40% weight on on the selection of the team. Project understanding, for example, might be 20%. So 80% is not about understanding the project. Um, and social or environmental credentials or expertise or alignment as a consideration, that might be 5 or 10%. So if you think if go back to part one of Hamid's presentation and where he talked about priority frameworks, the framework has been flipped. What's the number one priority with the way that we're setting up our procurement? It's financial, economic sustainability. Um, and then these, what we're saying is really important. Other elements of that framework are, in this approach, not as important. So what happens with this approach is often the scope of involvement from these technical disciplines is very limited in early phases of the project delivery to stay competitive, right? If it's primarily about getting the lowest fee, then you need to be really streamlined in who you bring onto a project and at what point in the project. A major contributor in the case of an open space or a precinct level development, might be a civil engineer. Even in a building project, reflect on if you're involved in the delivery of capital works, where are the greatest risks during construction? They're in the ground. So you can see that to manage these risks, um, it's really important to have that technical understanding and so the other side of though, or the flip side of the risks is the opportunities. And by the time the full team is engaged in detailed design, a lot has already been determined under this typical model, right? When it's primarily a single or a non-technical um, consultant and project working group, and you're leaving these specialists or technical consultants till downstream. By the time the full team is engaged in detailed design, a lot of it's already determined, and consultations occurred in both with internal and external stakeholders. Um, and the greatest opportunity to take advantage of their expertise has passed. We've lost a lot of opportunity. At the same time, you think about how do we manage the risks on projects? How do we manage typically, when you get into construction, how do you manage the costs? Well, naturally, the further downstream you go in a project, the ability to change direction becomes very difficult and more difficult. And the cost of doing so, it's exponential. So I've looked at on the next slide what an alternative structure could look like. And this is a model where, and say for example, this might be an open space project. Um, this is a model where the engineer's role has been promoted. In this case, it's the civil engineer. The technical role has been promoted. The human factors that Harm highlighted earlier are prioritized, and the financial when it comes to creation of the consultant team or the delivery model, the financial becomes secondary to those other priorities. In this case, the civil engineer is part of the project's leadership team. They take, um, I suppose, equal responsibility along with a lead designer, whether it's an architect, landscape architect, or so on. And they may be procured separately, these two, or it might be together in a partnership. But the point being that the procurement model drives the right objectives. It has the right priorities to get these sorts of outcomes. And when you have both the technical and the non-technical thinking side by side, you maximize the potential of both sides of the brain, if you think about it that way, right? Both the left and the right. And of course, the more that we're able to on any decision, capital project or any other decision in life, the more you're able to engage both sides of the brain, the better outcomes you can see. Now, the engineer's purpose changes. In a traditional model, they might be focused on the how, and that's solely downstream of delivery. That's about technical compliance, supporting implementation of decisions that have already been made. And you can get push and pull that occurs in that approach. The pull and push when it comes to delivery or implementation of a master plan or a concept design, and where potentially things are raised a bit too late that necessitates change away from what the vision was. Um, in this context, the technical is elevated to how, and that means that they're focused on the context surrounding the project. It means they have strategic objectives, they focus on social, environmental outcomes, they draw upon an understanding of legislation, planning schemes, client aspirations, and how the assets work within the organization's business or operational model. They have the complete picture. And when you have more information, you make better decisions. So over the next few slides, I'm going to share a few examples of how project outcomes change this. So systems thinking and climate sensitive design. So to introduce this concept, it's really a recognition of the inevitability of climate change, as I alluded to earlier, and the multi-pronged approach that's necessary to combat what will be the single greatest enduring challenge of this century. And there's three aspects to it: climate resilient design, regenerative design, and low carbon design. In other words, decarbonisation. So on the next slide, climate resilient design. That's about moving beyond just the industry standard, just the checkbox sort of outcomes to look at future proofing against climate projections. In Victoria, maximum and minimum daily temperatures will continue to increase until at least 2050. Victoria is where we're based. Warming is projected to continue if significant cuts in emissions are not made. Rainfall is going to be variable, declining in the cool season. Extreme rainfall events and high impact hazards like floods and bushfires are more intense. And in Victoria and nationally as well, sea levels will continue to rise for the next 100 years on current projections. So lowering emissions will help slow the rate, but it's not going to stop or reverse the trend. Now, there's many different ways that you respond to that. Sorry, just back on the previous slide, Hamid. There's many different ways you can respond to these different challenges. But for example, rising temperatures, and Hamid referred to heat island effects, increasing canopy coverage, alternative pavement surfaces, for example. When it comes to sea level, you might be increasing bunding, larger detention systems, and potentially you might even need to relocate existing assets, right? Now, just moving on to the next slide, if there's one key thing to take away is that you can get a 1,000% return on investment. So research by the CSIRO and the Insurance Council of Australia has showed that you can save $10 in recovery for every $1 you spend on adaptation. So, you can see the long-term financial sustainability, economic sustainability from applying these social and human health factors um, is incredible. Next slide. So the concept of regenerative civil design. So this is a holistic approach that reflects pre-settlement land and water management practices, and it reduces traditional manufactured infrastructure, ultimately focusing on nature-based solutions. Um, so to explain this in a short story, so rivers pre-settlement were often wider and they had shallow beds. They experienced strong water flow after rain, followed by long dry periods, which created disconnected ponds known as billabongs and gilgais. Now, when you design with a natural pre-settlement hydrology in mind, and you consider the catchment and watercourses and and indigenous plant species, you can apply and consider all these things to inform the site's design. And when you do that, you can lower the cost of development and you can ensure that the landscape is resilient and thriving and supporting local habitats. A key component of this is really a focus on maximizing pervious surfaces. So that's mitigating runoff naturally without detention by focusing on infiltration into the ground, permeable surfaces and pavements and so on, and slowing runoff. So the philosophy is that stormwater is treated as a resource, not a problem. Instead of draining runoff as fast as possible and taking it to a single point downstream for treatment, it is managed at the top of the catchment, at its source. In addition to increasing pervious surfaces, reducing the grades on drainage infrastructure, putting in more open channels and swales, and using techniques like leaky weirs, contour swales, and vertical drainage, you can reduce the peak flow leaving the site without needing the land take typical of water storage assets or retarding basins and so on. And the outcome of all of this is that you have reduced flooding, reduced heat island effects, and as we're going to see in a couple of examples, improved financial outcomes. Next slide, Ahmed. So just a couple of quick ones before I wrap up. So Harkness Cemetery. So there are two case studies here in the last 6 months or so. So Harkness Cemetery is out in Melton, and it's going to be Melbourne's largest cemetery development for the next 100 years. Now there's a total of over 100 hectares this site, and we were working on the 65 hectares of the Western District, looking at precinct level planning, and by implementing regenerative civil design, and I should mention as well, this is a great example of where the technical and the non-technical were combined in the procurement and the delivery in terms of the methodology for creating the precinct planning. So in this case, by implementing regenerative design, by adopting, for example, leaky weirs and contour swales, and just to explain that briefly, a leaky weir is what's on screen there. So it's not a completely impervious surface. It's actually or structure. It's actually made up of the natural or locally sourced materials, such as rocks and boulders and so on, found on site. It's as the name suggests, it's permeable. It's leaky. So it's almost like a natural detention or attenuation system. Contour swales is where instead of draining on grade, you have flat swales which focus on infiltration. And the result of all of that is that you can eliminate a lot of hard drainage pipes and detention basins. And what we found was, and what we're able to achieve is we gained back 18,000 square meters of what would have been ephemeral detention basins. We're able to restore the natural hydrological patterns. And in this cemetery, we were able to have the equivalent of an additional 3,000 of additional graves, which has a net financial improvement of about $15 million worth. Next slide, please. One more example here. So Altona Memorial Park. So again, by applying regenerative civil design principles, really limiting the hard and high carbon intensity or carbon footprint assets, through a lot of permeable pavements, contour swales, and leaky weirs, and so on, we were able to show a 28% reduction in embodied carbon compared to our baseline and typical design. Next slide, please, Hamid. So I've shared a few examples there about regenerative civil design and how it can produce improved financial outcomes and lower carbon footprints. But one of the biggest challenges for government is really the starting point. It's how do you measure embodied carbon for infrastructure, and that's been very difficult until recently. And so if I give a quick plug, we produced Australia's first comprehensive embodied carbon calculator focused on infrastructure. It complies with all global standards and national carbon measurement standards and so on. And the idea it's accessible and it's also free to try for anyone. Next slide, please, Hamid. So just to close out, we are also offering a free and evidence-based site analysis for anyone here today who's interested. And let's discuss how we can help unlock the potential of systems thinking in your particular, whether it's at a council level strategically or at a project level. So yeah, questions time. Hope it's been exciting and interesting. Hamid, what are your takeaways, I suppose, before we jump into questions?
Yeah, thank you so much. You can type your questions in the webinar chat box if you like. But yeah, thank you so much. I think the discussion that you propose clearly indicates the importance of human health and well-being as a top priority of system thinking. And then from there, if you do your job in the right way, you look after your environment in the second place, and you look after your policy in the third place, and automatically and naturally you would end up to a sustainable sort of economy. Your environment would be sustainable as well. You would have financial sustainability also already generated as a result of these right practices. Yeah, I really appreciate your presentation and your attendance. If you have any questions, or I can't see any questions so far. Is there any questions, or we can just wrap up the webinar? Thanks, Neil.
Thank you,
Well
Neil.
done. Yeah, thank you so much, Neil. I guess this is a good opportunity for council officers and landscape architects and people who are in planning in councils to think again, just simply think again what they're looking to the city, whether they're looking inside the boundaries of the council, they don't care about their adjacent areas, adjacent vulnerable communities next to your council. I hope that this brings some sort of attention and sort of vision for council officers and people who work in council, like landscape architect planners, to understand the city as a whole, as a larger whole, and yeah, act upon that. And again, the mapping which I propose in part 1, 2, and 3 of, mostly in part 2 and 3 of the discussion, you can take your specific council and look into your council in regards to vulnerability and what you've done for ameliorating such vulnerability. You're going to ask that. I'm sure that we would change everything in your council, and the positioning of your council would change from a simple service provider to a biggest provider of the health in the city. Any other questions, or?
Hamid, I think I see a question in a separate Q&A.
Okay, I couldn't see that, sorry.
So Christine Murphy said, "What are the biggest obstacles and what are strategies for individuals?" We might need a bit more context to that, but thank you, Christine, for the question.
Yeah. I'll just jump out the uh, share mode. And so what is the biggest obstacles and what your strategies for individuals is big change of for individuals, to be honest with you, Christine, individuals can't really do anything. This is all about, I explained the top-down process of, thinking, which is already traditionally relevant in Australian cities, both in Melbourne and specifically in case of Adelaide. You saw that generally state governments are controlling the metropolitan policies and large infrastructure, and that could create vulnerability for communities. The communities can't do nothing. That's the whole point of the discussion. Individuals can do nothing at the moment with the current planning in place. That's a very good question and clearly indicates that we need a bottom-up process along with that top-down process in order to put everything together in the right way with those priorities: health, human health and well-being, environment, and then you got governance, and then finally you get into economic sustainability. There is another question from Annabelle. Thank you for interesting presentation. Can we get AILA and EA to support a campaign to promote your alternative project model to local government across all jurisdiction? We love that. I guess, yeah, that's the whole point.
Mm.
Me, myself, and David spend a lot of time and research. Believe it or not, this is a result of about 6 months research that we just gave away in order for local government and local councils and state government to look into this problem. I myself in Meso space published several publications, like for example, reviewing the PSPs in Melton areas, and clearly indicate that we need some openings in order to stop blocking the western wedges. And the western wedges, in fact, are going to be blocked very soon, and this could change and demote the sustainable ecosystems in our areas as well, also in the west and north as well, east and north as well. So we would be really glad if any of you guys could promote that, and we support that. We can provide you with more publication, and if you like, evidence base behind that, so you can promote this idea, and hopefully we could have a better city to live in.
Yeah, thank you, Annabelle, for the I suppose the question and the feedback. Yeah, that'd be really exciting. I suppose out of all the participants, who's here a decision maker in local government? I mean, I think if I think about some of the challenges that we've come across from an engineering perspective in applying some of these principles on projects to date, um, it is often that but this is the way that councils do it, sort of thing, or this is the way our council has done it. These are the standards and processes and so on. Um, and it really takes one council or one organization to take that leap of faith and be the first one to do something different, right? From a delivery perspective, standard drawings or standard specifications are a big hurdle. And so it really takes someone who's able to communicate and uh, campaign effectively within a council to be the first one um, to help support a different. In one case, for example, we've been able to get updated standard drawings that implement some of the principles and processes that we've demonstrated. And once we've had the first council, we're able to go to the second council and say, hey, well, actually, this is what so and so council is doing, and we've able to see almost like a flywheel effect of each incremental change or improvement on one organization that helps to speed up the change across multiple organizations. So yeah, I'd be keen, Annabelle, to just discuss, I suppose, with Hamid about how we can I suppose work together and demonstrate and campaign in the right forums and the right processes. Maybe we can talk about that offline, Hamid.
Sure. Thank you. And I've got a shout out from Neil. You guys might be interested in an article I published on LinkedIn. I'm really interested to look into that, Neil, and I'll check and I'll be in touch if I would have any questions about that. Well, if there is no further questions, Christine, I've got another question from Christine. Was about strategy to affect changes in top-down traditional thinking. Thank you. Answered it potentially, mentioning strategies to combine institutes and organizations, combining their aims here. That's exactly right. That's a very good point, that at the moment, councils are working in solo within their boundaries, whereas the actual environment, if you remember the takeaway slide that I've showed you, the bigger picture of a city is something else from what councils are presenting and restricting themselves in. So basically, looking to the larger picture, we need first look into the larger picture and then narrow down to our city council, not the other way around, if you like. And that's a really good point. Thank you so much. And Smith, S.A. Smith, thank you so much for your comment, and I really appreciate you enjoyed the presentation. If there is no further questions, you've got another one. Thanks, Hamid and David. This was a highly valuable topic, and the work completed so far has been excellent. Thank you so much. I'm really glad that you enjoyed the process. Thank you so much. All good. This brings us to the end of the discussion today. Please stay tuned with our future webinars. And if you're interested to advocate such approaches for your city councils, please feel free to drop a line to myself or David, and we would help you go through from there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.